And you're live.
All righty. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Ian Isaacson. I am the board co-chair for the Oregon chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And I want to personally thank you for taking the time this evening to come to our virtual Pint night to talk about the proposed archery elk changes. Tonight we have Jeremy Thompson from ODFW, who's going to talk about their process that they've been going through for this proposal. And before we get started, just a couple things I'd like to highlight for you. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a button that says Archery Review webpage. If you click that button, that will take you directly to the ODFW project webpage site, where there's additional information and spots for you to add comments on the proposal. Also on the bottom of your screen is a button that says Ask a Question. If you have a question while Jeremy is going through his presentation or during the question and answer session after his presentation, we ask that you type in your question into that Ask a Question box. That way we're able to keep things organized and make sure that we don't miss anything. And then on the right of your screen, you can see the chat box. That's a good opportunity for folks just to talk with one another and amongst yourselves, and do a little banter back and forth, if you will. All right, not to hold things up any longer, I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy and we'll get this thing underway. So thanks everybody for being here tonight.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to jump in. I've got a short presentation here that we'll roll through. And yeah, like Ian said, if you got questions about what I'm talking about, throw them up. I got a big echo. Is that for everybody? Did that take care of it?
You're back.
I'm back. I still got an echo.
And it wouldn't be right without technical difficulties.
Okay. Gotta talk slow. I think somebody's got a feedback loop because we didn't have it when we were testing.
If everybody, I don't know, should be on mute, try that, Jeremy.
Okay. We'll roll through and see how it goes. Still a lot of feedback. That change my mic a little bit. Would that help? Okay. One more change. Are we good now? I'm not bouncing in my own ear. We must be doing all right. We're getting communications down.
Yep,
Thank you, Jeremy. You figured it out.
We got it figured.
All right. It wouldn't be a BHA virtual Pint night without technical difficulty. So we're right on par, right where we usually need to be.
Well, and I think it's important everybody knows we tested this. Like, we've been talking for a half an hour, making sure everything was good. And then here we roll out with all of you just to mix it up a little bit, make sure that it gets crazy. So I'm going to jump into my presentation. It's short and sweet, just want to get the conversation started. Dedicate most of the time tonight really to question and answer so that we can hear what you guys have to say, answer the questions, and really get some interchange back and forth. Okay, so that should have popped up. So kind of the two things that Ian had keyed up, BHA had teed up for tonight. So we wanted to talk about the archery proposal for 2022 regulation cycle that the agency's been working on and soliciting public feedback. But we also wanted to talk about kind of the big picture on how ODF&W sets tags and how we manage wildlife. So I'm actually going to start with that second point and really just hit kind of a couple high elevation topics to kind of bring us in line with how we start down regulation development as a whole. So, I think it's important to recognize that throughout North America, all of our Western Fish and Wildlife agencies especially, we're all working off the North American model for wildlife. Key points to that, the wildlife belong to all of us. Something that's been a part of our country since the inception. It's been fought for by a lot of conservation groups. The key parts to this that really help drive home the day-to-day management for agency biologists like myself. Science is the basis of wildlife policy. Everything is conducted with science in mind first. The other important part to me is always the fact that it's our user group. It's those of you that are in the room tonight that fund the conservation work that I do. And again, the other one here that brought us tonight together is the fact that all of our hunting and fishing laws that we create as an agency, and every agency does, those all come through a public process. So everything we do comes to a point where we're looking for the input from the folks in the field, or from the folks in the crowd tonight. As a state agency, we all have overriding statutes that dictate the management path we do as an agency. A couple of the keys here within the state of Oregon wildlife policy, we have to maintain all wildlife species at optimum levels. And those optimum levels are set through a planning process that we'll get to in a second. We also have to permit an orderly and equitable utilization of available wildlife. And that gets into a lot of our conversation that we're going to have here tonight too. And you can read all of these, statutes are great, but if you look at them too long, you get cross-eyed. The last driver we have in our wildlife policy is making sure that we're looking at all uses and we're balancing out those that want to use it, the social impacts, as well as that economic impact that those species have, not just for hunters and anglers, but for the state of Oregon as a whole. So coming down to kind of our next level, for the species that we hunt, almost all of them have a specific species management plan. These plans are laid out in a way to help guide what the structure and framework will be for our day-to-day management as district biologists. Our elk plan, the two key parts for this that have been a part of this conversation as we talk about archery elk regulations are the management objectives. And in our current elk management plan, we have management objectives both for population level as well as bull ratio. So that really dictates, on a by game management unit basis, we have targets to hit for the number of total elk in each unit, as well as the number of bulls that escape the hunting season. And there's a link down here. They're pretty good documents. If you're ever curious about how we go about our different species management, these are all on our webpage. And while this plan was written in 2003, the objectives that are in it were approved in 2016. And again, like everything else we do, wildlife's managed as a public asset. So these plans go through a pretty thorough public vetting process, both for plan review and as we talk about management objectives. We have work groups we get together of both interested sports people, as well as landowner community and local sporting interests. So pretty in-depth process that we use to set our species plans. Now it gets into the fun part of my job, right? So we look at these plans, they dictate our levels. Well, as field staff, it's our job to go out and determine what we have in each of these game management units. So, the part that everyone thinks about in wildlife management is the survey work. Annually, we go out and survey all of the species that we set tag numbers for to help start fueling the data process that goes into deciding season structure and tag allocations. For elk, these surveys are done throughout the state in March. We want to target elk while they're on winter range, but while they still have antlers, so that we can determine both sex ratio, so that's that bull ratio that comes into our management objective. And we're also looking at the number of calves per cow. so that we can look at that annual recruitment to help fuel some of our decisions down the line. We get done with the surveys, and this is where we start putting our data together. So this is our, a herd count data sheet that comes out that's posted on our webpage, publicly available for all of you to go in. I know a lot of hunters love to get in and look at this stuff to start looking at herd performance and how each individual area is doing. Again, we mentioned herds are managed on a game management unit basis. You'll see a few over here like Maupin, Biggs, Columbia Basin. We lump some areas. Those are typically elk de-emphasis zones. But these give us those ratios. These are the driving factors that help us manage species and look at long-term performance of how each individual unit's doing. And this data starts to feed into kind of the next iteration of how we monitor these populations. And for most of those, it goes into a population modeling framework. This is when we get out of the helicopter, we quit having fun, and we spend a couple weeks doing a deep dive on data and trying to look at where these populations are currently and forecast how they're going to go into the future. So we can use population models to start looking at what we think these populations will do into the future. And when we come to the specific tag setting process, that helps us determine the number of bulls, in the case of elk here, that we can successfully set tags for. We start looking at harvest data, we look at hunter participation, and we use all of that to fuel the equation that really comes into how we set tags, at least in a controlled hunting standpoint. Recognizing we do have a lot of areas in the state of Oregon, we're pretty lucky that we've been able to maintain seasons in a lot of spots in a general season framework and still be able to hit our escapement targets. Western Oregon blacktail, great opportunity. Can be general season for every weapon type. We still come into the fall when we conduct the mule deer surveys with enough bucks to meet our targets there. So that's kind of the difference when we start talking about setting tags. That's within that controlled framework that we have for a lot of our hunts in Eastern Oregon. And that all goes into the annual regulation cycle. So as an agency right now, we're setting regulations a year in advance. That's a new phenomenon for us. It's been about 5 years that we've started trying to forecast tags for the next year. As biologists, we used to have a really tight time crunch. We would fly all of our surveys, have them done by the 1st of April, and by the 1st of April, by May 1, you'd have to have your tag number set for that year. To try to allow more time for modeling and make sure we have time to go through all the data we have, we've expanded it. So now we conduct those surveys. So we just conducted surveys in the spring of 21. That data goes to look at tag allocations for 2022. So especially tied to the conversation we're here to have tonight, you hear us talk a lot about 2022 regulations. That's because we're working from now through September is when we're working on the regulation packet for the 2022 hunting regulations. And that goes into this. So the next question is that's how we get at, that's the 5-minute flyby on how we come about managing species and setting tags. We can talk more about that in questions. But now the question is, why are we talking about a change? As I mentioned, a lot of times we can meet those goals, the management objectives for species, and maintain a general season framework. That's not always the case. As many of us might remember, Eastern Oregon used to be completely general season for elk. That changed in the early 90s with one of our first elk plans that we put together in 1992. Shortly thereafter, we adopted management objectives for bull ratios for almost all the units in Eastern Oregon. We were well below those. And that led to a change in how we managed rifle hunting. We converted almost all of the bull hunting opportunity for branched bulls in Eastern Oregon to controlled seasons in the mid-90s. That led to a shift in hunter participation, this ongoing change over the last nearly 40 years of how hunters have put themselves in the field and where the harvest is coming from. We're now at a point where in a lot of our key elk units and some of the elk units that we're having some biological concern, we're still seeing close to 50% of our bulls taken in a general season now. And that's leading to challenges for our biologists. And that's really why we're here to talk tonight. So that's why we're talking about changes, is the challenges that we've experienced and we started talking about in 2003 those challenges that we've had as an agency in meeting some of our biological objectives through continued general seasons in Eastern Oregon. So, as many of you probably recognize, we started talking about in this regulation iteration, we started talking about changes to Archery Elk last year, concurrent with the changes that went in for 2021 with archery deer. And this was an extension of a couple different previous archery regulation reviews that we had done in the past. 2003, we had an archery review committee. The goals for that committee were the same. The concerns were the same as what we're still experiencing today. It's looking at hunter crowding and density concerns that are voiced to us from hunters in the field, potential elk displacement that occurs at the onset of archery season, as well as the concerns over harvest that occurs in a general season and how that was at that time and still today affecting our ability to allocate controlled tags on the rifle side. So last year, as we sat down as our regulation review team, and for those that aren't familiar, we're in year 5 of a process that the agency's undertaken to really go through and completely look at our big game hunting regulations. Started with an editorial review, got into unnecessary rules, and this last little bit has been looking at season structure and how we offer the hunts to our constituents. This was a part of the process last year, looking at how we offer hunts. This elk proposal that we had as part of the 2021 package was similar to deer, right? All of Eastern Oregon controlled so that we had a unified approach to archery hunting as a whole in Eastern Oregon. But we heard a lot of concerns with that, especially looking at the fact that under this proposal, there would have been no general season for archers. That was one of the big things. So we stepped this proposal back, held it to review it again this year. And we started that, again, put our regulation team together. We took all of the comments that we heard from the public outreach last year, as well as some of the concepts that we had heard in the past through the archery review, and tried to step back and really ask ourselves, if we're going to propose a change in Eastern Oregon, where do we really need that change? So this focused around looking at data, looking at archery hunter participation, the percentage of harvest coming during archery season, as well as units that were below bull MO and needed a harvest reduction. That created the center for this year's proposal. And this has been out and about. Again, that button at the bottom of the page for the archery review webpage, that's got all the news releases. That'll let you go through that full history. I think most of you have been through this part of the proposal before, so I want to be able to kind of move into from where we started, which is this map here, for initial public outreach, what we heard through this public outreach component that we've been working on, and the different proposals that the different concepts that we're going to be taking into our June commission meeting. So one of the first things that we heard from all of you when we started talking about our draft proposal for 2022 regulations was the impact to youth hunters. There's a strong desire through the entire hunting community to make sure that we have ample opportunity for youth to get out and hunt. We heard a lot of comment about the ability for a youth archer to be able to come over and experience those units in Eastern Oregon that their family had hunted traditionally, but still be able to hunt at home, given the challenges of getting kids out and getting them away from home. So one of the things that we'll be asking our commission for direction on is how to approach youth hunting in the archery season as we approach the 2022 regulation cycle. So that'll be one of the things that'll be coming out as a informational point to the commission in June. And we'll talk more about the commission process kind of at the end of the presentation. The second input we heard through that initial map that I showed you, you could see that we had proposed 2 general seasons in addition to the single unit controlled hunts as part of the agency's package. There was a couple different comments and different concepts and ideas that came out through public review about ways to modify the general season offering to provide some different aspects and some different hunt experiences for folks. The first comment we heard was moving the general season line from the crest of the Cascades to basically I-5. High level of interest in maintaining intact wilderness. To look at that, we can maintain the Cascade wilderness areas by shifting that and putting all of the west or the the West Cascade slopes in with Eastern Oregon as one general season, and then maintaining the Coast Range as a second. Kind of the simplified version of that would be just to erase the split and still maintain a single general season archery tag. Then hunters can still move about in those units that aren't controlled as they currently do, and be able to hunt both in Eastern and Western Oregon, and be able to cross unit boundaries and experience those wildernesses in the same way as the split on I-5 would be. So that, again, we'll have, as we go to commission in June, it's going to be kind of a three-tiered approach of how that we want the commission to direct us in looking at general season offerings. The third component that we're going to be asking for commission direction on will be looking at a potential zone. We looked at a bunch of different ways to limit harvest in the units that are in red on the map. One of those that we initially looked at as a regulation team was, a zone concept, which is basically putting two or more units together into a larger controlled hunt. As a team, we rolled out with single unit controlled hunts as our recommendation because of some concerns over not being able to maximize tags for archers in a zone concept. And that comes down to, with our by unit management objectives, we need to be able to meet escapement goals in each of those units. If two units are paired up, one of them's below MO, but the other one's above, we could potentially be taking opportunity to hunt out of that one that's above MO by reducing the overall harvest to meet the objectives in the unit that's below. That was what we thought the hunters wanted, but we heard pretty loud and clear through public review that it's still important to be able to look at some larger landscapes and maybe assess what that different opportunity would look like. As we heard those comments, the most common spot that we had the request for a zone was in and around these units that you see in purple on the map, and those center around the Eagle Cap Wilderness. Again, we've heard loud and clear that wilderness is important to our hunters, and I think especially to this next generation of hunters that's coming up that our agency's now starting to interact more with. Being able to go out and have wilderness experience is important. So we'll be asking for commission direction on looking at a what would essentially be a test zone. Putting these units, the 5 units in purple, the Catherine Creek, the Minam, the Imnaha, the Pine Creek, the Keating, putting those into a potential test zone, allocating tags out. As we do that tag allocation, working with our bios, it'll mean about a 13% less overall tag reduction or allocation for the zone than what it would be by unit because of some of the harvest concerns or the bull escapement concerns we have in the Keating. But we still want to provide that opportunity to let people get their voice heard. And we're going to talk about that in a bit too, about is it important to have a maximized tag allocation, or is it more important to have some of these unique experiences as we move forward in this process? So I've talked a lot about timeline. Again, I'm trying to get through this pretty quick so that we can all just have a conversation. June 18th is when we're scheduled for an informational briefing to our commission. What that means is we're going to roll up, we're going to give them a presentation. They'll have a packet in hand that highlights everything that we just quickly went through. Looking at the initial proposal that we rolled out for public review, as well as seeking input from the commission on those 3 concepts that I just went over briefly. Potential youth hunt, modifications to general season, and that test zone. We're hoping that commission packet will be ready for public review in the next week or so. Again, that button at the bottom that says Archery Review webpage, the minute I'm cleared to release that to the public, we're going to post it on that webpage. Cool thing about that button, you can not only see the webpage, but you can register to get updates. So the minute we post anything new on that page, it sends you an email and lets you know. What we're hoping is as we roll out that packet, that's the next phase opportunity for everybody to provide input and feedback. We want to hear about the different components that we're looking at modifying in that proposal and try to assess what a final proposal should look like as we go into rulemaking. So we'll take that information from June. We're going to put together what we hope is an acceptable proposal to take into the August 6th commission meeting for rulemaking. That's outside the normal timeline for the 2022 hunting regulations. September is when we'll hear the rest of the regulation packet and commission. And we're doing that to make sure that archers have full opportunity to get their voice heard in front of commission. Years past, we've proposed archery changes at the September commission meeting. Well, as many of you in the room probably know, that's dead center of when you all want to be in the woods with your bow. And that created a lot of friction. So we're trying to be responsive to that and make sure that the commission is outside of the archery window so that anybody that wants to participate in the commission process has full ability to do so. And again, the top blue link on this, that's the webpage. That's that button at the bottom of your browser there. You also have a couple emails on this page. The bottom one, that's my personal work email. Any direct correspondence you want to have, questions you want to ask about the process, that's the email to use. The agency's dedicated me to this process so that we can make sure we have somebody available to answer questions and interact with the public and make sure that we're getting as much information out as we can about why we're doing this and what we're hoping to carry forward. The middle email, that ODFW wildlife info, that link is also on the webpage. So again, we've got links for both that you can click on through this process. That's the one, if you've got a comment letter that you want to go straight to commission, that's the one we encourage you to use. At this point, we're in kind of a really narrow gap between our periods. All the emails we've taken to date have been part of the process of developing this proposal package. As you've heard me talk about input, we've received about 500 unique comment letters on the process to date. Those have all gone into helping to shape what we're going to take to commission here in June. They will also be provided to our commissioners to help them see what we saw as a regulation review team as we put together this process. So again, those are the venues for getting the information out. With that, I'm going to open it up and we can start answering some questions.
All right, Jeremy, thank you. And just a reminder for everybody, if you have a question, please put your questions in the question and answer tab that you see at the bottom of your screen. If you put questions in the chat box, I'll try to make sure to see those, but I cannot guarantee you that I'll catch them. So, Jeremy, do you want to just kind of start off on the top question here in the chat box, and we'll just start ticking through those?
Yep, we'll start right at the top. Looks like Andrew Riggs has asked about the choose your weapon model. Andrew, as we've rolled through that, looking at our social science, so we conducted a couple different statistically valid social science surveys with Responsive Management. They're a company that only does fish and wildlife social work. As we look at the data we got from that, one of the fears we have as a regulation team is choose your weapon may actually increase our archery hunter density and increase that pressure and harvest that we're seeing. So the challenge with choose your weapon is at this point, we can't get the reduction in harvest that we need in those units that are below MO. When we start talking about the Starkey, the Keating, the Pine Creek, the Desolation, we need to be able to find a mechanism to reduce bull harvest. Currently, the only thing we can do in those units that are below MO is to cut rifle tags. But if we look at the Starkey, 60% of our bulls are getting killed in the archery season. That's not going to get us where we need to be. Choose your weapon is one of the options that has been talked about since 2003. It was the preferred option in our archery review committee. The reality is, with where we're at today, there's nothing that indicates that would get the reduced harvest that we need to see from this process. Second one I have up here with the region proposal. So the region proposal, there's been a bunch of different region proposals that have rolled out. OHA was the lead on some of them. BHA provided us a couple. We've had multiple meetings with representatives from the sport group leaders as a whole. When we started this public outreach process, we asked all of the sport groups that engage ODFW on different topics to provide 2 representatives to come sit in the room and help us talk about these alternatives. One of them was the regional proposal. As I briefly bounced over when we talked about the eagle cap zone, one of the concerns is we started talking about regions. And I'm going to assume that you're talking controlled regions. We'll talk about a couple other ways. With the controlled regions, we're still looking at managing to that least common denominator. The concern with zones as we started laying them out and playing with what if scenarios is it always leads down a pathway of less overall tags for archers in a controlled scenario than what it would be by unit. Oregon's elk management plan lines out that we manage elk on a game management unit basis. Our surveys are conducted as such. Our management objectives are set up for those. Not being able to set hunts as those provides that complexity that ultimately could lead to, and our examples have shown would lead to, fewer overall tags for archers. So it would take longer to draw a tag, which is something we're trying to avoid, and just to have that complexity. Early on, there was also talk about general season regions. Really anything that's general as a whole right now for those units of concern in Northeast Oregon, we can't guarantee a harvest reduction in a general season, which means we're going to have to look at cutting rifle tags to get back to our management objective. As an agency and through a lot of the comment that we've got through this process, we want to make sure that we're building that equitability in on how we allocate the opportunities and how we make the reductions necessary to get to MO. So that's been the biggest challenge. Anything general, not going to get us to the needed harvest reduction. And looking at, one of our goals with the eagle cap zone concept is to test out, let it run over time. There'd be enhanced monitoring if we move forward with that zone, looking at archery participation by unit, trying to break down right now. One of our challenges is that our archery participation data is from the hunter reporting survey. So it's which unit did you hunt the most or which unit did you harvest in? But we don't have the next tier of questions of which unit did you hunt in the second most and how much, and being able to really break down. We've got the social science survey that shows us 38% of archers only hunt in one unit. But being able to go through and just run through the social science, we want to make sure that we're meeting the maximum tag allocation we can to be able to get as many archers in the field still. So with the proposal, it would be, we're only looking at tag reductions in those areas where we currently have management objective concerns. In the rest of the controlled units that are at or near that MO, we'd be capping participation, really trying to avoid that shift that we think would happen. If we control the Starkey and didn't control the Ukiah, we would assume that we would have a lot of folks jump across based on what we saw when the Ochiko went controlled and the Chestnuts and some of the others. So it's a long-winded answer, and I think I've walked around about 6 times. So poke me if that doesn't completely get there, Andrew. But the reality is we rolled with a by unit proposal to maximize tag opportunity and be able to get as many folks in the field as we can. So the next question up is how are we going to manage that increase in pressure during the Western Oregon archery season? That's one of those questions that we've had, is what will we see for a shift? Again, we got to refer back to that social science to try to guess based on hunter desire and opinion what they're going to do as we make some of these changes. As I've gone through that, we've asked hunters, are you interested in Eastern Oregon? Are you interested in Western Oregon? When you play those numbers percentage-wise, it appears as though people are currently hunting Western Oregon at a rate that they have interest in hunting Western Oregon. So if you combine hunter participation data and social science data, they suggest we won't see a huge influx. We won't see a lot more people in Western Oregon. We know that's going to occur somewhere. How that comes about, does it create a concern? We're going to have to monitor, right? Anytime we make a change, we can forecast out, we can look at our data, but the reality is we're going to have to monitor that. And that's part of the conversation that's gone into how we manage the residual general season. One of our goals as a regulation team when we suggested the split and having 2 separate was to reduce the total volume of hunters with one given tag that might show up in one specific unit. And that concern is really heavy for Northwest Oregon. Trask, Saddle Mountain, Santiam, they're 3 of our 5 most heavily hunted units in the state. The question is, will more archers try to hunt that? And that we don't know. That's one of the reasons as we've looked at tag allocation, total decrease in tags from what we suggest is current general season participation and what we're offering for controlled tags. It's not a huge reduction. Some of the reduction will be taken up by a loss of non-residents. As we go to controlled hunts, that puts a cap on non-residents. So some of the reduction in tags will be from non-residents that no longer can draw that in a given year. But we're trying to set up, at least at the onset of this, in the units that are currently meeting their management objectives, we have enough tags that we're assuming that everybody that applies first choice will be able to draw that tag on first choice. And there'll probably be a couple units, at least at the start, that are available on second choice too. So we're trying to still provide enough opportunity in those units going controlled that we don't see a large shift into Western Oregon. But in reality, we're going to have to monitor hunter participation and see what that does. Dan also asked if we've talked about putting Western Oregon into controlled hunts. At this point, no. We're still meeting our management objectives in Western Oregon. We do get complaints from archers about hunter crowding, but not to the same degree that we do in Eastern Oregon. My Western Oregon counterparts, so I'm the district biologist out of the Dalles, work with a lot of people right over the crest. Their joke is there's more archery hunters in their units. They just can't see each other. It's not as open. But, we don't see the same complaints. We don't see the same biological concerns in the Western Oregon units. As hunter densities increase, as hunter interest increases, we can't say that there won't be other units that won't shift into that potential need, but at this time it's not there. So the decision why not to make control tags valid for the general season, that really goes back to that increase in Western Oregon units. As we look right now, current controlled archery tags are used almost at the same rate in general season units as they are in the controlled unit that they're valid for. So if you take all the controlled archery tags that were issued last year, 45% of the hunters reported hunting in the general season, while 55% were in the controlled season for participation rates. The two reasons that we want to limit portability on controlled tags is to maximize the opportunity for archers to draw them if they want to draw them. If a hunter has to choose between, because 65% of our hunters live in Western Oregon, if they need to choose between hunting at home and close to home or traveling to Eastern Oregon, there will be that intentional choice between hunters that will ultimately reduce some of the hunters that currently cross over and hunt both. They'll choose one or the other. That reduces total hunters that participate in both the Eastern unit and the Western unit in a year. That increases the likelihood of drawing the tag. It also reduces the potential for those increases in the Western Oregon units that we were talking about just a minute ago. It does, so we talk about flexibility and fire. So in those units that we're proposing for controlled hunts, what we want to do is look at a modification of our fire policy. It's not something going to the June commission because it's not something we need commission direction on. Our current ODFW fire policy is an internal policy. So our goal is, and we've got different trigger points for loss of opportunity on what we can do for hunters. In the past, because of the flexibility in archery seasons, the options we've had available have really been centered on short duration rifle seasons, because those are the ones that we had to make changes due to fire. What we're proposing to do is to add some flexibility to the fire policy where if one of the controlled units has a complete loss of opportunity during the season, we'll be able to then make that controlled tag for that year valid in the general season to add that ability for folks to then still be able to hunt and move back out into one of the general season units. So we're still trying to add that flexibility, Andrew, but do it through the fire policy. And again, just trying to maximize the ability for folks to draw those tags. So asking about why we can't look at a quota instead of a draw. So, again, it's kind of that supply and demand. Oregon set up their controlled draw system because we have less supply than we have demand. Being able to allocate those tags evenly is one of our goals in having a controlled hunt system. The other point, a lot of times we hear the tie-in to controlled hunt points, preference points, and a quota. If you start to look at a lot of quota systems now, people would be forced to buy that tag before they could apply for their point. So you wouldn't get that added benefit of being able to have a preference point hunt a quota. So that's a couple of the concerns that we had with a quota system. The other component is, one of the other overriding goals of this long-term process we've been in for regulation simplification is providing regulations that are easy to understand, not only for our existing hunters, but for new hunters. And looking at adding a quota system adds complexity to a system that we already get a lot of complaints about the complexity of. We recently went away from our only first come, first serve, which is essentially a quota system for spring bear because of the concerns we had of how fast those tags were selling out. And because people were buying them so soon, they weren't actually participating in the opportunity at the same rate. So we've had some experience with the quota in Oregon, and it was one that we've recently moved away from because it wasn't working. I'll draw that one's there. So Dan asks, what's the plan for managing out-of-state hunters? Statutorily lined out, controlled hunts. Every controlled hunt in the state of Oregon, we can only give a maximum of 5% of our controlled hunt tags to non-residents. So at any hunt that goes into a controlled hunt structure, you can look at total tag allotment. 5% of those are available for non-residents. Once we hit the non-resident cap, that 5% cap that's legislatively lined out, then no other non-resident will be allowed to be successful in the draw. So you see that currently. You can go through from our webpage and look at our point summary reports for controlled hunts, and you'll see it generally takes an extra point or two for a non-resident to draw than it does a resident for those desired hunts where we hit the non-resident cap. Not every controlled hunt in Oregon hits the non-resident cap, but the ones that do, once the non-resident 5% is hit, then no more non-resident tags can be drawn. Asking about the north side of the north side. So the desolation as a whole will be rolled out for a controlled hunt. I don't have the exact numbers, but the desolation is one of those that will see a slight reduction, but not by much. When you look at what we forecast out for total hunter participation currently, it was a slight reduction over that, but not by much. Probably still at a level where we would expect the desolation to be, almost an every year draw. So 60% bull harvest for the Starkey data. So that's all off our mandatory reporting data. Anytime I'm talking about harvest data at this point, current data is all derived from mandatory reporting. Anything prior to the mandatory reporting system came from the old telephone surveys. So we look at our reporting data to get harvest for all of the wildlife management that we do. And that's where the 60% branched bull figure came from. And that, I think we have a table. It was part of the process last year. I think it's still up on the webpage, but it broke out by unit, both total tag allocation, as well as harvest percentage for all of the units in Oregon. So that should be up there. Total tag reduction, that's going to vary depending on which process we go through with. On a by unit, I can't remember the exact number, but you're within at least 1,000 tags with the reductions needed. And I could go back, I can get that answer for you and get it out. And it will be on the webpage soon. But 600, it'll be a few less than that. As far as 600 will be about what the non-resident reduction is in hunter participation, but I can't remember that exact tag reduction number, but it'll be a little bit more than 600. So when applying for tags for archery controlled hunts, yep. So preference points are by hunt series. The question here is, do we have to use the points we have? State of Oregon, our points are by hunt series and they don't differentiate weapon type. So similar to the scenario going into 2021, deer preference points 100 series, they're all good for any 100 series hunt. So you can choose archery hunt, you can choose rifle hunt. A 100 series point is good for any deer tag there. It'll be the same for elk. So any of your elk preference points can be applied towards any elk hunt in the state. So last day you can submit letters to the commission. For the June commission packet, we'll roll out. You'll have about a 2-week comment period. There'll be a date there. I can't remember the exact cutoff date, but it'll be probably about a week before the commission meeting. So for this iteration, we'll be looking at early June as a cutoff date. And then there'll be another opportunity, right? So this is an informational briefing going in June. We'll be able to take all the input, lay it out before commission, and get some direction on what they want to see in August. August is when we'll go to rulemaking. We will again roll out another commission packet in the month of July, as well as through our public meeting cycle. We'll have another round of public outreach and trying to get out and talk to folks about what we're proposing and why, and give that opportunity for people to provide not only comment, but feedback. So that's where that one was at. I'm sorry, I got lost in the comment box there too. So if the ideal solution's adopted, I think as we started talking tag allocation for this coming 2022 cycle, most of our biologists were trying to target a 3 to 5 year window to be back at their bull MO. And as once we get back to that bull management objective, if we can maintain that moving forward, that's when we can start talking about adding tags back into hunts. And at that point, we do so proportional to all user groups if it's a controlled hunt. What percentage do we hope this reduces? Again, we're looking at a reduction of hunters, but we still want to be able to provide hunters that opportunity to go hunt their first choice. So while in a lot of our most popular units, we think a controlled hunt will reduce the overall number of people that step into that unit at a given point. For those that are at or above management objective, the goal is to kind of cap participation with those that hunt it the most. So we're not shooting for a reduction in hunters. What we're shooting for is harvest management and being able to look at the need for reduction in bull harvest in 7 units that are below MO, and ensuring that we're not, spreading those biological issues to the units that are adjacent to those that are close. Will the proposal generate more state money? So we're doing the revenue forecast now. At the start of this process, I would have told you it would be revenue neutral, just because I think the assumption that a lot of us came into this process with is that archers were already applying for controlled hunts. As we jump into the data, we've seen only about 1/3 of archers in a given year are currently applying for a controlled hunt. So looking at, financial impact, we have to tease out how many additional controlled applications we're going to get. If you're not playing the controlled hunt game now, are you going to play it, because of this, or are those 2/3 the ones that are hunting primarily in Western Oregon? Honestly, this is going to be a fairly net zero financially for the agency. It doesn't have an impact one way or the other. How do we ensure that hunter opportunity doesn't decrease in Eastern Oregon? What our goal is to do is to try to impact populations range wide and increase opportunity for everybody. There's a lot of ongoing efforts right now looking at habitat restoration and management, trying to improve. A lot of our work keys in and focuses on mule deer, But what's good for mule deer can be good for elk too. And there's specific elk projects going on as well. Blue Mountain Elk Initiative is the prime example of one of the agency-driven efforts that's ongoing. Looking at some of the new tools that have been put in our toolbox. For years, my counterparts and I felt like we managed the species and the federal government managed the habitat, and we were stuck just doing whatever Forest Service action was proposed by the Forest Service. With the Walden Amendment, with Good Neighbor Authority, that's changed. As a state agency, we have a lot more leverage and a lot more partnership with our federal land management agencies to be able to go out and conduct habitat restoration on the landscape. A lot of good work going on right now, both through adding fire back on the landscape, looking at targeted habitat enhancement, looking at the road network and trying to continue to maintain habitat integrity. All of that work adds up with the goal of adding more elk on the landscape. We have to increase not only the elk herds, which is a little bit problematic as we talk about this. In a lot of these areas, the elk herd is healthy, the bull numbers are down. Part of that comes into where we've seen elk shift. As we see increased recreation pressure in Eastern Oregon and this changing dynamic in the forest habitat component, more and more elk are moving onto private land. And that's one of our largest struggles as an agency, is not only making sure we make enough elk to increase the opportunity for everybody, but trying to get those elk back onto public land where they don't create conflict, they don't create damage concerns for private landowners, and they become more readily available to the hunting public. So the goal, make more elk, get them back on public land, that's done through habitat restoration efforts and in this long drawn out process that we're trying to work through. So if the department is willing to ask the commission about a test zone, how come the department isn't asking the commission to test going to non-resident draw, choose your weapon for a year to see? So we're at a point where we have to decrease harvest. We can still manage harvest, whether it's a zone, whether it's a by unit. That still gives us the management ability to meet our biological directives in the elk plan. We can go through a non-resident draw. When you look at total volume decrease, it's not enough to get us where we need to be just to manage non-residents. And again, choose your weapon, depending on how you look at the social science, that may actually exacerbate the problem. And then we're even further behind, and it may take 7 to 8 years to get back to management objective instead of 3 to 5. That's the chance that we have to take. So zones are a decrease in opportunity because the least common denominator. That's true, but we're still setting tag numbers. So that still gives us the ability to meet the elk plan directives that we have and be able to get to where we need to be. For those that have built up preference points for archery elk, will we need to use those to draw any unit hunt, or will those still be available to save and build? Sarah, I think that's probably the hardest part of this process for some folks, is that if you want to hunt one of these units that's proposed to go to a controlled hunt, you'll have to apply and potentially lose your preference points. Obviously, I still think there'll be some of those units that at least for the first few years will be available on second choice, but we won't know that until we go into a controlled hunt process. So, if you want to hunt the Starkey unit, for example, Sarah, you're going to have to apply. It's going to have to be a first choice draw. That will mean that you would have to utilize the points that you have. So as it is this year with archery elk and any of the other times that we've gone from a general hunt to a controlled hunt scenario, and we've had those throughout time for a lot of the Eastern Oregon rifle hunts. Most common scenario has been as we've moved the east slope of the Cascade from general season rifle to now completely controlled rifle over the last 12 years. We've had that same scenario, and it's kind of that unfortunate shift as we need to move for management purposes that forces those folks that have hunted that area to now apply, and any points that they have would then be used. Have extended seasons been talked about in units that are going to draw? As we're talking about having to manage the hunts, Dan, adding in additional days is not something we've talked about. As you look at the archery season, there's very few instances of added days. The only one that's come up through this process is the traditional hunt in the North Fork Wilderness. That's another one of the components that we'll be taking to commission in August, is a modification to that traditional hunt. But that's not something we've talked about in adding days. So if we're unsuccessful in a Western General Archery tag, what's the issue with offering those archers a rifle tag like Idaho Archery Tag for an archery fee? So we'll start there. So Idaho has the ability to kind of offer these dual opportunities because they have far fewer people and half of their state is a wilderness. Completely different biological set in the state of Idaho than what we have to deal with in Oregon. So because they do have that surplus, they can offer those dual opportunities for their residents. We don't have that. We have, it's a supply and demand issue in Oregon. We have more demand than we have supply. So it's how do we manage out and try to maximize the ability for hunters to get a field and experience a hunt in a manner that's still biologically responsible. In Western units, why is rifle cow tags months longer and archery's only weeks? We get a lot of questions about rifle cow tags. A lot of those long, any legal weapon hunts are not set up to meet our biological objectives. They're set up to meet the social needs of elk. Those come into damage management. And damage is a whole different scenario when we're talking about elk management in the state of Oregon. And it's one that, my counterparts and I spend a lot of time on. We're legislatively mandated to manage damage regardless of management objective status. So even if an elk herd is below management objective, we still have to mitigate damage to private lands. So a lot of those long cow hunts that you see are really, the goal of those is not to kill elk, but it's to help move elk off of those private lands and back up into public lands. So, and with a lot of those, they are any legal weapon hunts, and we just offer a single hunt because we're not viewing that as a recreational opportunity. It's a management opportunity, trying to help get elk where we want them. So we have seen, Bob, having cow in the bag limit for archery units definitely decreases the harvest on bulls. But we've got from our 2014 archery review committee, we set up guidelines for when we'll have antlerless opportunities in units for archery season. And we follow those guidelines in which units have a bag limit for any elk versus one bull. So, those are the units where we no longer have that recreational surplus on public lands for elk. And that's why that's taken out. So as we've seen in the general season, we generally don't see more bull harvest when we switch the bag limit. We actually see archers move out of that unit. So, again, it's one of those we have to watch the data play out and see how it comes in the future. So question about LOP. So LOP is just like preference points. It's set up by hunt series. So we'll go through, landowners will now have to choose if in those units that we're proposing for controlled hunts, they would have to choose whether they want their LOP tags to be for archery season or for rifle season. It will not add additional tags within the landowner preference drop. What impact has the increase in predators on the landscape had on MOs? The predator conversation is one that we could spend 2 or 3 nights on. In my opinion, it's one of those, it has more to do with kind of the long-term population dynamics of elk, not as much with bull escapement. But again, the key factor through a lot of our research is getting out and improving habitat, getting elk back on public lands. That's the key to improving elk overall. elk population management objectives as a whole in the state for overall population density are doing really well. It's our bull escapement that we're struggling with. And that's in part because we in Eastern Oregon, we have so much of our harvest now coming in general season, and that general season has seen a slow increase in participation over time. So we're just getting more and more harvest in those units, and to a point where we need to be able to cap it and regulate it so it doesn't continue to increase. Tristan, that's the best question I've seen. What we need to help, all of our game species is we need more voices at the table when we start to advocate for things such as road closures, habitat management, fire management on our national forests, getting involved to help have a voice for what deer and elk need on public lands. There's a lot of voices in the room. We do well at getting some of our partners involved, but the more we can be heard within that federal arena, especially as you look at the current nature and use of public lands in Oregon, there's more and more push for increased recreational access, which is a great way for all of us to get into the woods. But we need to recognize as we pioneer into new areas where we don't currently have trails, we don't currently have infrastructure, that ultimately reduces the habitat effectiveness and the total number of elk or deer, pronghorn, bighorn, you name the species that uses our public lands. The more we encroach on the open landscape that they have and they need, the fewer elk, deer, pronghorn we're going to have. Going back to the Idaho question, that's one of the areas where they thrive is they have the Frank Church. Oregon does not have a large intact wilderness system to provide that core habitat that we need in the state. And as we continue to build more roads, build more trails, find new ways to recreate, we're only eroding the habitat value for all of those areas. So, have we talked about better ways to manage predators? Well, that's not part of this discussion now. Looking at the tools available, we're exercising all of the tools that we have as an agency. I think you would need to see some other changes in looking at predators. But again, in my area, in the Cascades, predators are more effective because there's fewer places for deer and elk to go to get away from them. As we continue to bottleneck our deer and elk populations into smaller and smaller habitat areas, the effects of predation are only going to increase regardless of predator density. We've got to make sure that deer and elk have escape areas. They need to have contiguous habitat. They need to have their movement corridors to be able to move across the landscape. In my mind, professionally, in this state, that's far more important than overall management of predators. This doesn't have to do with hunt applications. How do you guys do bull and cow ratio surveys? So how we do surveys, Grant, I'm a little bit, I'll try to answer this. So our surveys are set up as we're doing, especially if we're talking about elk. The key for elk surveys is most of our surveys now are done from a helicopter. Historically, they were horseback, they were walking routes, some fixed wing. We've all shifted to helicopter surveys. We set up either sampling grids or designated routes to go out throughout winter range and look at elk. We can go through in a lot of our elk habitat and be able to get pretty good sample sizes to be able to derive those ratios. Elk are one of the easier animals for us to survey. The challenges can always be anomalous years in weather. Is it a heavy snow load? Was it a late spring? Are the elk not on the green up areas? We'll still survey those elk, but they may be in a different unit. Our management objectives are all set up for wintering elk populations, meaning we're looking at where the elk spend the winter to do those surveys. And we get out on the sampling grid with a helicopter and fly those elk areas and count all the elk and classify the ones that we can. Bruce, so as we start to look at harvest, that is, again, we're modeling out using those population models. But that was the goal as we started to look at tag allocation, is what harvest reduction would we need to be able to get back to our bull management objective within that 3 to 5 window. So that's our goal. Now, again, that depends on environmental factors in a year. Drought years like this one aren't going to help us achieve those goals. We're going to see a far lower calf crop this year already because of the way the spring conditions are. So that's the goal. That's what we challenged our biologists with, is what level of harvest reduction do you need to try to hit it in a 3 to 5 year window based off your current models. So, that's the hope. It'll take longer in some. As we start talking about units like the Starkey, it'll take a little bit longer to get there. Would we ever go back to general season over the counter? I think every one of us would love to come back to a component where we had the ability to be general season over the counter. At the point where every controlled hunt is, we have more tags than we have applicants, that's the point where we'd absolutely look at over the counter hunts. With the influx of population and development in Oregon, I'm not going to tell you I'm optimistic we're going to get there. I'm trying to see. Oh, it's Matt. Your name doesn't pop up for me, Matt. As we've talked about, yeah, I'd love to be able to go back to over the counter, but it's, there's a lot of factors that would have to come into play. So if elk go where their needs are met, are there partnerships with the federal and state land management agencies to improve habitat? That's what we're trying to work on. So, my local example, here in the North Cascades, we've been able to come in through collaborative partnerships with all of the land management agencies and really focus in habitat restoration efforts under a couple different umbrellas to focus on areas adjacent to those private lands to help pull those elk up. Modifications to CRP for us, looking at controlled burns, forest thinning and mastication to reset and invigorate the shrubs and forbs that we need. That's absolutely what we're working on, is trying to focus in, and we're trying to collect better data on where the elk go so that we can focus those habitat initiatives in the right spots too. There's a large collaring effort going on through Eastern Oregon to try to get that data and help us, best put our money where the elk would already use. So Tristan's question inspired this one. Does ODFW support keeping electric bikes out of areas currently closed to them? So we did submit a letter within the current federal process, Colin, talking about the increased disturbance that comes from electric bicycles. We're also getting a large push through our state wildlife areas to allow them. ODFW has always taken the stance that an e-bike has a motor and it's a motorized vehicle and should be managed as such. That's the stance we've had. It's part of the fight we're in. So we're absolutely in support of that. And in reality, we're actively fighting e-bikes alongside the federal land managers on our state land as well. So, yep, we're right in the middle of it. So have we conducted field surveys for hunter numbers? We go out and check hunters constantly, Trace, throughout our units. It's hard to get a statistically valid sample when you're out checking hunters. It's hard to keep track of how many times. Unfortunately, we see a lot of hunters that drive the circle, and you may drive by them 2 or 3 times in a day. We do base a lot of our opinions on hunter participation based on those field surveys. Our biologists keep track of total hunters checked, total camps, and that has been increasing. So the trend we've seen in our field checks corresponds very nicely with what we see in our hunter reporting data. So, we do conduct those, but the hunter reporting data is a better avenue for us to look at participation. The one thing I've done through this process, one of the questions we asked in our social science survey was, which unit do you hunt the most? Which one do you prefer? We were able actually to take that social science and overlay it with hunter reporting, and the percentages of hunters, lined up very, very well from what they reported they liked to hunt and what our hunter reporting data said they did hunt. So I think that's probably our best check we have on the system. Much more, scientific than what we see in our field surveys. What can hunters do to help in this process? I encourage everybody to stay engaged. It's great that we have 111 people in the room tonight. I'm hoping this is one of the benefits to the entire COVID situation that we've lived with, is we've found new ways to engage hunters and be able to get folks in the room and talk about regulations. Not enough hunters engage with the regulation process to keep up with what the agency's proposing and what the commission's reviewing. My example I've used through this entire process has been the fact that in one of my managed units, the disabilities permit has not been valid for 10 years, yet I still have multiple hunters report harvesting with their disabilities permit every year. As an agency, we struggle to get our hunters to read the regulations, let alone take that next step and help engage in the process and help formulate regulations and priorities moving forward. So, through our webpage, through our social media, throughout groups like BHA, these partner groups that help us get the word out, I encourage everybody to find their venue and get engaged and be a part of the process, because it's amazing as a professional, the power that your voice has within any of our decision processes, especially at the commission level. Larry's asking about wintering area protections for shed hunting. You've seen that through our Eastern Oregon wildlife areas. So in the lands that we manage, we've absolutely instituted that. I think you're going to see more and more closures come in to protect winter range, especially as we continue to see development on the fringe of winter range. So, that will be one of those things that we will likely need some assistance with, but we definitely have a lot of winter area closures now that we look at, and we generally close them, just to all human entrance, not just for shed hunting. But one of the things that we've started to talk about internally is expanding that window to a little bit later to protect the elk as they're especially elk as they're starting to migrate up during that shed period, because of the influx of people we see out creating disturbance during that time frame. So youth generally that allows hunting controlled units take less than 5 points to draw. Bob, that's along the lines of what we're going to ask the commission direction on. The most common way that we've had requested for the youth general season tag is that it be valid in any unit that's general in 2021. As we've talked about that internally, really if we're going to have a general season youth tag that overlaps controlled hunts, there's no reason we couldn't look at a few of the current controlled hunts too. Sled, Chesnam, Ochiko, Maori. So that's the concept that we're moving forward, but we need a little bit more input as we go through the commission process. Morgan, we've talked about that. As professionals, we've talked about trying to institute a season for shed hunting. I think, trying to regulate that, I guess I'm sitting here trying to picture the public process that would go through and the voices that would come out as we tried to adopt a season or have a tag. But, we need to find a better way. I think it's important that we identify any disturbance point for wildlife, especially in the critical periods of their life history, whether that's on the winter range or calving grounds. We really need to identify those critical points and come up with progressive ways to protect them and make sure that we're keeping them in the areas we want them. So we've talked about that. That's an idea that's been kicked around for a lot of years. That's one, Morgan, that would help us out. Getting a letter from one of our partner groups to help push us that way helps with the political arc of us, looking at changes of that magnitude.
Well, Jeremy, that appears to be all the questions, 36 in total. So unless anybody else does anybody else have last second questions? If not, we'll start to wrap things up. All right. Well, Jeremy, on behalf of BHA, our board and all of our members, and on behalf of archery hunters in Oregon, I truly want to thank you for coming on tonight and going over this. I think all of the questions and the responses were phenomenal. I hope everybody got a better insight into this current process and future processes and how important it is to get engaged in these wildlife management decisions. So I want to thank you. I want to thank all 111 people who joined us tonight. That is phenomenal. Your guys' support and participation, in these virtual Pint nights allows us to keep doing them. So I would encourage everybody that once Jeremy has his board packet released to the public in the coming weeks, that everybody take a look through those. If there are parts of those options that Jeremy talked about tonight that you are especially passionate about and would like to see make it through the process and confirmed by the commission, make sure to reach out to those commissioners and let them know that what you support and why. It's very important to get to be and stay engaged on this stuff. So Jeremy, again, thank you.
Yeah, my last plug, Ian. Everybody, before we sign out, click in, check out the Archery Review webpage, sign up for the updates. That way you get an email every time we post something on there. As we go through this public process, there's been a lot of questions and different thoughts come up that we didn't think about. We try to put the information on that webpage. Every time I post, you get an email so you can stay engaged, stay up to date on the process. The ODFW wildlife info is on that webpage. I don't think my personal email is, but at the top of the chat box it is. So if you've got more questions, you want to engage on something specific, grab my email. Don't hesitate to reach out. A couple of you in the room have become regulars. I enjoy the conversation, and it helps us craft this going forward so that we can make sure we've got the best proposal to meet everybody's needs.
All right. And I want to thank especially all the folks on the Pint Night tonight who are current BHA members. Thank you for your support. If you are not a BHA member, I would support you guys going to the BHA website and becoming a member. You get updates on this process through that. Also, follow Oregon BHA on Instagram and on our Facebook page, as we'll continue to post updates in our stance and our support for particular aspects of this current proposal. So again, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everybody out there on the interwebs, and we will call that a night.